Safety is a story. It's something we teach our children so they can sleep at night, but we know it's not real. Beware baffled humans. Beware false prophets who will sell you a fake future. Of bad teachers, corrupt leaders, and dirty corporations. Beware of cops and robbers. The kind that rob your dreams. But most of all, beware of each other. Because everything's about to change. The world is going to crack wide open. There's something on the horizon. A massive connectivity. The barriers between us will disappear, and we're not ready. We'll hurt each other in new ways. We'll sell and be sold. We'll expose our most tender selves only to be mocked and destroyed. We'll be so vulnerable, and we'll pay the price. We won't be able to pretend that we can't protect ourselves anymore. It's a huge danger, a gigantic risk, but it's worth it. If only we can learn to take care of each other, then this awesome, destructive new connection won't isolate us. It won't leave us in the end so totally alone.
Halt and Catch Fire is fucking good. But it isn't as well known as some of AMC's other shows. So, without spoilers, I thought I'd make a broad case for why this show is not just fucking good, but fucking relevant, because it is. Halt and Catch Fire may appear on the surface to be some kind of Mad Men retread. It's a period piece that uses the past to talk more openly about today and tomorrow. It centers around brooding, work-obsessed visionaries whose work gets used by the show as a microcosm for the entire society around them. Does that sound familiar? But this Mad Men stuff is only skin deep. Halt and Catch Fire departs from any resemblance to any other show on AMC or any other channel by finding its own voice. But that voice is being used for a complex set of ideas on how to think and feel about the digital revolution that the show covers. As much as Halt shows us the degree to which these engineers and prodigies created the world we live in today by a sheer force of will, it does not shy away from showing the price of that revolution. Nor does Halt run from the negative side to the story. In other ways, we see through its characters a perfect microcosm for today. The same technology that can and sometimes is used to unite us is the very same technology that we use to backstab, betray, humiliate, harass, and crush each other. But I am trying to keep this review spoiler free, which means I'll try to avoid any specifics about the show past the pilot, much at all. That being said, I think the case can still be made for why this is a fantastic show without giving away its best moments or deeper complexity and subtlety.
Their early work was a little too new wave for my taste.
There have been some pretty depressing depictions of the 1980s when you think about it.
In the 80s, it was morning in America.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
But as easy as it is to criticize the decade for all of its 50s fetishes, soullessness, and decadence, that doesn't really give a full picture. Since the 21st century, in many ways, sort of kicked off in the 1980s, a show like Halt and Catch Fire, one that doesn't have an axe to grind against the era of shoulder pads and leisure suits, is a refreshing and necessary shift. Based in part on the iconic book from 1981, The Soul of a New Machine, Halt and Catch Fire is a fictional depiction of the evolution of the personal computer. The show starts with the PC, and by its fourth and final season, which is set to come out next year, it will have charted the path from those early years all the way into the mass initialization of the internet in the late 90s. At the show's center are 5 characters. At first, they felt closer to archetypes than well-rounded personalities for me, but by a few episodes into the first season, you sort of figure out that a lot of subterfuge goes into the way these characters are shown initially to the audience. Our biases and preconceptions are subverted by the show in a way that ends up kind of feeling smart as hell and meta as hell, too.
No.
What?
Great.
In the pilot episode, for example, Gordon fits the exact requirement of pilots to tell the audience and the network with a character who the target audience of the show is.
You've made just enough safe choices to stay alive, but not enough to matter. Is that what you want? You can be more. You want to be more, don't you?
Think back to Breaking Bad. That show's pilot does a fantastic job of getting us inside Walter's head and on his side. But why? Well, it's because we're repetitiously shown him as a weak, imperfect, but valuable human being struggling to find meaning in a life that, in his case, is literally dwindling away. But this serves a deeper purpose beyond setting up the basics of Breaking Bad as a show. Television is about getting viewers to see themselves in one of the characters, usually the main character. This isn't a hard and fast ruler or anything, just a kind of writer shortcut to get people on board with a storyline. You might say people naturally resist being introduced into new shows, new stories, because they need to be shown a reason why they should take it seriously. By giving them a sort of avatar on screen, they're given the impression of inclusion. By rooting for Walter or for Piper at the beginning of Orange is the New Black, many of us are really just rooting for reflections that we see of ourselves. But since The Sopranos, TV has made a lot of mileage from subverting this formula. Again, if you look at Breaking Bad as it transitioned from season 1 into the later days of the show, this idea is made clear. Thinking of ourselves as Walter White works fine in the beginning when he's the underdog, but the brilliance of that show is how it rejects the usual expectation to give us vicarious triumph, friendship, success, and so on. In the early hours of Breaking Bad, we're being set up. Not for fantasy fulfillment in the show's virtual universe, but rather for a cold, hard stare into an actual mirror, into the heart of darkness of human beings.
It's the heart of darkness, Jez. It's the fucking dirt.
I don't want to go into the heart of darkness.
Come on, dude. Sometimes you gotta flip the switch.
Breaking Bad only works because we begin seeing things from Walter's perspective. It's by virtue of that setup that later, when Walter begins to descend into antisocial and later psychopathic behavior, we don't get an easy out. We can't pretend that Breaking Bad is a simple tale of a monster of the other. We cannot deny it's about ourselves, again, because we were the ones there all along cheering Walter on until it was already too late. Much like Breaking Bad and Orange is the New Black, Halt and Catch Fire is interested in humanizing and empathizing with people on the margins of social mores and respectability. People who dare or just sort of are different whether they want to be or not, who do otherwise and subsequently are punished for it by a conformist society surrounding them. What's unique and fascinating in Halt's case is that it charts the uprising of these outcasts, these geeks, over the entire world, through the technology that they create. If Breaking Bad and Orange are all about self-restraint, social atrophy, and other harsh realities of the human condition, Halt is sort of the opposite thing entirely. It champions people not for their ability to socialize into accepted norms and sustain empathy for others or moral vigilance over themselves, but rather it extols us for our inability to be anyone other than ourselves. Juxtaposed with the cold and powerful technology which the show conveys to be rapidly expanding, we come to love the characters of it precisely for their difficult, contrary, stubborn idiosyncrasies.
All those dillweeds, they want to stick around.
Cameron is a punk with a self-righteousness complex. Gordon is a wallower who can't get over his failure to launch a PC line of his own in the late 70s. And later in the show, we see that even with this issue dealt with, Gordon is just an all-around oddball. Donna is the closest that the show has to a conventional moral center, but interestingly enough, if anything, with her we ironically find the show's idea of a bad moral character. She thanklessly falls into the role of woman and mother, while Gordon does not. This inability to express or assert her needs as an individual are clearly broadcasted by the show to be a product of a sexist society and not a personal failing, but it's undeniable that it's Donna's tendency to not ask questions and fall into social rules and expectations for women that also leads her later on in the show to use things like dishonesty and distance to get what she wants. She has a difficulty really connecting, especially with all of the men surrounding her in her life. It's not like she has a lot of other options. She's not Cameron's age, and if there's one thing this show makes devastatingly clear, it's how much difference there is even between two women of such relatively close ages as them. And finally, we have the show's closest thing to a Walter White or Don Draper, Joe McMillan. I actually started out disliking Joe, probably like most people did, since he's basically one coke sniff and expensive cocktail away from Patrick Bateman in season 1. But unlike Bateman, we see that Joe's individuality isn't all toxic or corrupted. He's actually as driven as he projects himself to be. By season 3, this is an undeniable aspect to his personality. It's just that Joe doesn't know how to do anything but be driven. He doesn't know, like Donna, how to authentically communicate or interact with people. He has to learn it through his relationships with the other characters on the show, which is why it's very rewarding to watch him and the other characters grow together. Precisely because he's a product of the hyper-capitalist ideology of the late 20th century, this is a figure that we recognize all too readily.
There's also free install for
Gordon.
I mean, every character on Halt is in some way a product of that ideology. But Joe isn't just shaped by it. Unlike the other characters, Joe embodies it. Cameron, meanwhile, is Joe's total opposite. It's what makes their relationship feel not as compulsory, lazy, and boilerplate as it usually is on TV when it comes to romances. From the pilot, you can tell that these two are attracted to each other, but by that same virtue, they're natural adversaries as well. What's important in a show like this, again, is heart. The meaning of these individuals to not be lost under the white noise of all the technology. Because the protagonists are all unrepentant individuals, they feel life-affirming and wonderful to spend time with, instead of just being downers. That was a problem I actually had with parts of Mad Men, actually, even though it's one of my favorite shows. This is something I think Halt arguably does better, even. Being shown the humanity within the tumult and the period piece stuff and the drama. Being given laughs that don't usually come with a smirk, that aren't some sarcastic, cynical observation, either about how fucked up things were at one point or how fucked up things still remained over time. That isn't to say that I don't love the harsh brutality of Mad Men and tearing off the veil of 60s nostalgia most walk into the show tucked into like bubble wrap, but Mad Men only works because it goes against the grain. And since, as established, the grain, when it comes to the 80s, unlike the 60s, is already usually pretty harsh and critical. I mean, can you imagine Forrest Gump set in the 80s? I don't think so. Going against the grain in the 80s case implicitly requires a more optimistic approach, a totally different take on the 80s and its humanity, its importance, and its overall character. Halt doesn't shy away from many of the negative aspects to 80s and later 90s culture, but really the contemporary moments of these characters kind of feel like a blur. They feel almost like astronauts inside a spaceship hurtling towards a black hole. We all know where their revolution is headed, in other words. But what's so awesome is to watch it take shape, not as an inevitability or accident of history, but rather through the struggle, diligence, drive, and integrity of human beings. It doesn't really matter that in the end, the internet and the mass culture it created weren't the utopian dreams their architects once shared. The point, I think, in Halt's case, is that the entire world is now different because of a small handful of people who, as Joe says in season 1, refused to conform to the world and rather insisted that the world be forced to conform to them. At zero level, it's a show that respects and humanizes those who think differently, as much as it is a love letter to the digital technology that empowers individuals to unprecedented heights of creativity, connectivity, and power.